Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service. Nisswa Tax Service offers tax preparation for individuals and businesses across from City Hall in Nisswa and on the web at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Lakeland Currents. Where today we're talking, actually it's our third series with my guest today, Ben Winchester, who is a research fellow with the University of Minnesota Extension. Does some very, very interesting work. Does a lot of his work in Minnesota and in Nebraska on rural issues. And one of the things that I've always found fascinating about what Ben's research is showing is that it's really showing that we have a lot of misconceptions about what's going on in our rural areas. And as I said before, Minnesota and Nebraska are the two areas where he has spent most of his time. Today we're going to talk about leadership and some of the things he's finding out about leadership in rural areas. Yep. Welcome to the show again, Ben.
Thanks for having me back.
It's nice to have you here. You've always got really good information. What would you like to start with?
Well, I'd like to start with, I guess, that the notion that social life is somehow dying in rural areas. And, you know, this really struck me years ago when we would talk about the apathy of the young people and that we were having trouble getting elected leaders or people to run for our elected positions and our appointed positions. And we still see that today. We see trouble getting mayors. We see trouble getting city council people. So there's this notion that people don't want to be involved and that they don't have a concern for civic life anymore. But we've got a pretty rich history in a number of ways across not just Minnesota, but the nation as a whole. And I'll draw back on a little bit of a history lesson here in that de Tocqueville, when he started traveling around the U.S., especially the eastern seaboard, he was very interested by the fact that Americans were very willing to create social associations. So if they needed to build a church, they would rise up, band together, build the church, and disperse back out to the population. And they did the same thing whether it was building schools or playgrounds or having some type of active social activity in the community. People would band together, rise up, and dissolve back. Well, when I started thinking about de Tocqueville's work today, I thought, when is the last time that we really dissolve back? You know, we've got a lot of groups in our communities, and when people come together to meet a challenge or if there's a problem that needs to be addressed, that rarely do the people end up kind of being dissolved back to be tapped into later. So I started exploring some different data sources, and the first data source looked at just the number of cooperatives in Minnesota. I mean, people in Minnesota don't mind working together. There's a reason why Minnesota led the nation in the creation of cooperatives 100 years ago. It's that because there is an advantage to having your private interests fulfilled through social kind of activities and through social bonds. So within Minnesota, we've got this very rich history of social life. And as I started to look more and more at the data, I started to realize that not only is there a great presence of nonprofits and civic groups in Minnesota, but they've been growing at a pretty astounding rate. So, for example, between 2000 and 2010, Minnesota's population went up about 8%. But overall, the number of nonprofits in the state went up 20%. So this really astounded me in the sense that, well, I don't believe social life is dying if people are still willing to kind of band together and create all these new nonprofits. So as I explored the little more kind of the urban and rural differential there, I noticed too that even in our rural counties where we experience a 5% decline in our populations, we still see a 15% increase in the number of nonprofits. So this for me is an indicator that not only is social life alive, but we've got a lot of new people moving to our community, and we've talked about this in a previous show, is this migration of 30 to 49-year-olds moving into our rural communities. And our in-depth research is showing now that these brain gain folks, these 30 to 49-year-olds, do move into a community. If they've got kids, they involve themselves in leadership positions within the school districts especially. But they're also very involved in being active in their own social interests. And this is part of a larger, I would say, global trend, especially within the U.S., of becoming more individualized. So we're becoming less social and more individually oriented in terms of our day-to-day activities. So what this means is that people are involved, but they're involved in their own interests.
When you're talking about co-ops, are you talking about everything from a food shelf to a co-op like an initiative foundation that serves 5 or 6 county areas? So you're talking about the gamut of the...
Yeah, I mean, really the early co-ops, and we still have them around today, around telephone, electric co-ops. We've got dairy co-ops, so that kind of history there. And we've also got kind of this new gen co-op model that's taking place too, especially in the agricultural industry. But when we talk about foundations or kind of the regional development commissions, these are also, these would be more state agencies because of where their funding comes from. But in a sense, there's still agencies that are there to help work in and for our rural areas and other communities of interest.
When we talk about leadership in our rural areas, it seems to me that one of the things that sort of gets tainted is we see the radio, or listen to the radio, and we see television shows, and we read in the paper about all the negative things around a mayor of a city or the city council. And I think what we probably forget is all of the places where they're successful and they don't have these kinds of issues. Is that true, do you think?
That's very true. We've got, I think it's nearly 37,000 registered nonprofits in the state.
Wow.
Across the
state.
Minnesota? In Minnesota alone. And there's also more thousands of government agencies like special sewer districts.
They don't all have my phone number.
I
can't believe that.
It's really an astounding number of groups that we have that people create. And these are socially created animals. People band together to create dairy cooperatives. They band together to create these electric co-ops. A lot of times they're there to meet problems or specific needs that we've got in our communities. But there has been a shift in how people have been involved. So traditional groups, I would say the Kiwanis, the Lions Club, some of these groups are very place-based, and they have a very wide focus. So, and these have been transplanted by very narrowly focused, wide geographical organizations. And let me give you an example. So 100 years ago, the Hancock Community Betterment Club would do everything from helping, again, with the school district to helping build the senior center to you name it. Everything within Hancock, that club would be there to help support. Well, today, we have groups like the West Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association. It's a very narrow interest, but a wide geography. So it's really this shift of how people want to be involved with their time that's dominated some of the headlines that we see. So we do talk about the fraternal organizations and their membership groups losing their membership base. But at the same time, we tend not to see a lot of these interest-based groups that have risen from all of these newcomers moving in that have really taken the place of social interests in our rural communities. So this is almost a diversification of our social interests in our rural communities. So we used to be monoculture in our rural communities, but now we're multicultural. We've got community groups that represent wide swaths of social interests across our communities.
That's really interesting because I think of like a senior citizens group I live in Staples, and we have a pretty active senior group, but I don't think it's real large. Mm-hmm. And then I think of all the people in the community that are of that age that don't get involved with that. Yeah. But maybe they're doing something else then.
They are. When we talk about, I don't know if you're familiar with, Robert Putnam did a book called Bowling Alone, and he lamented the fact that he believed television was one of the primary factors in why people were not being involved anymore. And he used people who bowled alone as opposed to people who bowled in groups as a measure of this lack of social solidarity. But my point here is that people just aren't bowling anymore. They may be riding bikes, they may be riding snowmobiles, they're doing something different. So just because where you look may have declining numbers, and we've seen this with churches, we saw this especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. As our rural communities became more secularized, we saw the rise of more and more churches. Of course, when you don't have a monoculture religious base, then you've got more churches sprouting up, and then some that were big at the time losing their base. So it's kind of this intermix of change that happens in our rural communities where, things that happen in one time period are replaced by another. And so again, this is kind of what I like to look at is the data to tell me what's going on in our rural communities.
Are you seeing that a parallel between Minnesota and Nebraska? I mean,
you bet.
Very similar.
Very similar. Nebraska, again, even in its most rural counties that experience great population losses, they're seeing a rise in the number of nonprofits. And that means people are moving in. There are these 30 to 49-year-olds moving into our rural communities, and they're starting groups. And the Blandin Rural Pulse, the Blandin Foundation does a survey every year that measures attitudes and opinions in rural Minnesota. And they found that 53% of rural Minnesotans were engaged in a leadership position in their rural community. That for me is a pretty high figure. When half of the people in your community are involved in a community group, that's fairly high. So I started using some of the nuances that they found in their data to look at this nonprofit data. And what I found was in our most urban counties, about 1 in 111 people need to be involved in a leadership position. And when I say leadership, I mean positional. You're either president, vice president, secretary, or treasurer. Kind of the core group that runs that group. But in our rural communities, so 1 in 111 in our urban communities, but it's down to 1 in 11 in our most rural counties. So really, one person on every city block in our small towns needs to be involved, not just as a volunteer in our community groups, but as a leader.
That's really fascinating. Getting back to your group concept for a minute, Minnesota passed this legacy legislation a number of years ago. I think that's astounded the whole country that this state has invested. Public television gets some of that money. Our lakes, our rivers. Would that be fitting into your model a little bit?
You bet. This is part of the rise of the nonprofit. So again, we had a decline in the mutual benefit organizations, but the environmental nonprofit groups, we saw an increase of, I believe, 42% in the number of environmental groups between 2000 and 2010. So that means there are more people getting involved at the local level. And these are regional. And again, these aren't place-based when we talk about environment, because environment transcends our political boundaries. So your watersheds go well beyond your county lines. So these kind of political jurisdictions don't always match up with our environmental jurisdictions, but that space has been filled by the rise of these nonprofits, whether people are looking and concerned with water quality or the forests or the lakes. This has been a big issue for Minnesotans, and I think rightfully so based on our background.
When you work with small communities, and you do mostly rural work with what your research has been, how do you help them understand what this means for getting new leaders to their communities?
This is an important challenge for our small towns. So I'll tell a little story here. When I first moved back to the Morris area, to Hancock, I had been part of the Red Cross when I was in Morris during my first stint. And then I moved to Missouri for graduate school for 5 years, and then I moved back. Within 3 days after moving back to Hancock, or buying a house there was a message on my voicemail that said, "Hi, Ben, this is Bob from the Red Cross. Just wanted to let you know you were elected vice chair of the Red Cross last night." And I thought, well, I mean, I love the Red Cross, don't get me wrong, but it's this type of social obligation that you see in a rural community that doesn't always attract people to it. Another example may be people that invite you to be in the Lions Club. Well, what does that mean? I don't want to commit myself to an open-ended obligation here. So I think there are some nuances in how the newcomers and the younger people, the millennials, especially as they move into our small towns, in how they want to be involved. And it doesn't entail joining a group for the sake of the group's name. It entails some level of personal commitment and personal involvement that they want to have in that group. So it start out slow. It doesn't mean always just tell the people to come to my meeting. Like, hey, we've got a meeting on Thursday, you should be there. That really is almost honestly the wrong approach to these newcomers. It is finding out what their interests are. But even before that is finding out where these newcomers are. Because honestly, what I found is people don't always see the newcomers in our small towns. When we've got a turnover of 30 to 55% of all people in a community over a 5-year period, which is fairly high, how do you find these people out? When we all run in our we all run in our same circles. So, and I relate it to people that work different shifts. If you work first shift and you work second shift, you don't eat at the same time, you don't shop at the same time, you don't always do things at the same time, and you tend not to see one another. This is the same idea is true for people in their social life. The groups that you're involved with aren't necessarily the groups that I'm involved with. So it takes a concerted effort to be able to do the bridging here between those two social worlds. And we in Extension have programs that work on this. We have a social capital program where we're doing bridging and bonding between these types of community groups that exist in our communities. And this is the type of work that needs to be done. Finding the newcomers, recruiting them based on the differential interests that they've got rather than our place-based groups, and finding better ways to integrate them into our existing leadership structures.
It used to be that there was a welcome wagon in a lot of our communities. I don't know if the welcome wagon exists in any more communities or not.
Not as
much.
But
what are communities, in your experience, what are communities doing to identify new people now?
It's pretty difficult. We're in an age of privacy right now. So the welcome wagons in the past used to get a mailing list from the post office or the city clerk that said, here's the list of all the people that moved in the past month. Why don't you, do your work? And you can't do that today. There are privacy concerns that people have, and even if you could obtain a list, it might be a little scary for people to get that kind of knock on the door without being invited to something else. What we have found that works is beating the doors, finding the newcomers that have moved to our rural community. We did a project in west central Minnesota, and we were going to go out and interview and invite people to gatherings in 5 western Minnesota counties. And we started to sit down and come up with a list of the actual names of the newcomers. And we thought, well, if we can get 50 people, we'll be doing all right. And within a month, we had 600 people on the list that were new to the region in the past 5 years.
Wow.
This tends to snowball. So what we did, and one thing that's really worked well is in some of our rural communities, is having a newcomer evening. That means it's not driven by the existing community groups. It's a chamber that donates a couple $100 to help get a supper together and get the newcomers together and have them to get to know each other. There is the idea of cohorts here still, and that is millennials hang out together, Gen X people hang out together, baby boomers hang out together. And while we do try to transgress those lines, there is some social capital that does need to be built within those cohorts. So it's this type of an idea that let's find the newcomers, let's invite them in and get them to know one another and see what opportunities there are for them to be involved in their own community.
I have a selfish question. I belong to a number of groups and a couple clubs, and in all of these clubs we seem to be having a pretty good turnover, and maybe we're not doing what you're suggesting here. Don't just get them to come to your meetings, but see if we can find out what really interests them. Is that something that would be key to, like a Rotary Club or a Lions Club?
You hit the nail on the head. It is, we have to do business differently in our existing groups.
Wow.
We can't continue to say, here's the 4 events we're going to have every year. And when we want to get somebody involved in our community group, that they've got to tag on to these events here. It may be a negotiation where we're going to reduce 2 of those events and come up with 2 new ones based on what the newcomers want to do. It is a touchy situation. And kind of reaching back to Dodokville, like, when's the last time we voluntarily dissolved a community group? I can't tell you. When we create...
The American Legions are some groups that I see that are starting to fade away.
Yep, they're struggling.
In some of the communities. Would that be an example?
That is an example. And so I've worked with many groups that have had 2 to 3 people to 5 people showing up at meetings every month. And it's a struggle to keep this group going. And my point is, what are we going to do? Are you going to continue to hold meetings with 3 to 5 people for the next number of years until you dissolve out? When, honestly, I would like to see these people that are involved in this group transition themselves to a new group, because these people have the history. They've got the knowledge, the experience of how to run community, how to run community events, how to run community activities, how to involve people, how to do fundraising. There are a lot of aspects to maintaining a community group, and these people have a wealth of experience, but there tends to be this divide between the existing traditional-based groups and the new interest-based groups.
For people that didn't see your program on the Brain Gain, could you just talk a little bit about that too as it ties into this?
You bet. I think a key message here is that rural areas have actually been increasing in population since 1970. In Minnesota, even the rural population has went up by 11%.
Wow, but I don't think many people realize that.
No, I hear this
even though
all
we've
the time.
talked about it.
And I say, raise your hand if you've heard this before, and very few people have. When the headline tends to be more about the percentage of people living in rural areas.
Or the retail stores that have left town.
Yes, or the retail stores, and all of these kind of structural changes that we've witnessed. But the fact is, more people are living in rural areas than they did in 1970. And these people are continuing to move in decade after decade. 70s, the 80s was a little bit of a dip, and the 90s was a skyrocket for our rural growth. And what we found was this was primarily in the 30 to 50-year-old age group. And there were 3 primary reasons people gave why they wanted to make the move. It was slower pace of life was number 1. Safety and security, number 2. And the low price of housing was number 3. And nowhere, surprisingly, in the top 10 was a job. So people were really moving out to rural areas for quality of life. And these aren't like the back to the land movements of the 70s. These are people with masters, doctorate degrees that are able to telecommute, that are able to do their architectural job in a rural area. there are a lot more opportunities for people to survive in a rural area than ever before.
Wow, that really is fascinating. I read an article yesterday in one of the state newspapers saying that there is a migration now from suburbs back to the metro areas. So in some of the bigger city areas, that trend is reversing kind of the other way.
Yeah.
For some of the same reasons that you talked about, not because of jobs, but don't have to drive as far, closer to a theater or to the grocery store than it is in the suburbs. And it's a different set of interests coming from these young people than their parents.
You bet. And really what we've seen on the kind of urban-rural dynamic here is that our young kids leave our rural communities, our 18 to 20-year-olds leave, and they go to the metro. The metropolitan counties, the core metro, Hennepin and Ramsey, do a very good job of attracting 18 to 25-year-olds. But generally, and more specifically, they are not able to hold on to people over the age of 30 to 35. So almost all of the age cohorts above the age of 30, metro areas cannot hold on to those folks. And this is actually kind of a surprise because, you know, what we find in this cohort life cycle model is that people graduate, they go to a college county or to a core metro, and then after college, everybody goes to the core metro. But then after the age of 30, people are reconsidering their move. So they're moving out to the suburbs and to rural areas alike. So it's this kind of in and outflow of people within all of our different communities across the state.
Wow. When you work in the extension area and you're working with rural communities, what are some of the things that what kind of services do you provide to communities when they want to talk to you?
Yeah, we offer a number of different services. Our two primary arms are engaging people in leadership and civic engagement. And this can take place in terms of leadership, individual leadership programs, where we would invite a cohort to get together and go through and gain skills about how to run effective meetings, how to deal with conflict, how to analyze your own leadership skills. Where on the other side, it may be civic engagement. So, for example, we work with environmental agencies to help people understand, with PCA specifically, to help people understand some of the statistics that come out about your environment. So it's both leadership and civic engagement on one side of what we do, but on the other is economic development. And here we want to retain and expand our businesses. We want to train people in using technology in order to expand their businesses. And we want to just have people understand their own retail markets. So we've got a number of different programs in both those areas that help our rural communities survive and thrive in this century of change.
The thing that I've found fascinating about you is you always have such clarity to your research, and the outcomes are so easy to understand. And I think that you would be a benefit to, your organization would be a benefit to any rural community that's wondering what they can do to make themselves more vibrant or have more vitality in the community. You have a website, and what is that called?
www.extension.umn.edu. And if you click on community, we're in the community arm of Extension.
And how many are doing what you do in Extension? How many are there's 3 or 4 of you in the state doing what you're doing?
Yeah, roughly 3 or 4 kind of content area specialists, but we've really got a number of educators. We still have people that are running about, helping with our community meetings, doing our leadership programs, doing our technology training, and we're offering more and more webinars too. So I think we're helping to keep pace with the change that we've seen across Minnesota.
Getting back to the leadership thing for a minute, what are some of the things that you see happening from your research in your organization? What are you going to try to do now with this new data?
Sure. A lot of this, so for example, part of this data, when we look at nonprofits, like which counties have experienced a rise in the number of nonprofits? These counties that experience the greatest rise in the number of nonprofits are ripe for leadership programs. So I'd like to say that all these new community groups have a really great leadership structure. But in a sense, it's just a group of people getting together to say, I want to create a snowmobile club. That doesn't mean people are well-versed in how to run their 501c3 and how to manage your finances and how to make good decisions and how to arrive at consensus within your community group. So this is part of the work that I really enjoy seeing done, is helping to build the technical and leadership capacity of our rural communities. Because there aren't many studies out there that give you examples of the impact of bad decisions. I mean, you might see some things about a group might have engaged in a lawsuit because of a bad decision they made. But especially on the good side, like there isn't a lot of research on the other side of telling you What's the value of a good decision-making structure? So this is part of what we want to look at, and we've got a number of researchers within Extension. Our educators do research as well, and helping to answer some of these questions. We have to understand the research base before we can offer programming.
Do you see it's real strong leadership in regions, or is there really no difference?
We haven't seen big differences, and even like the Rural Pulse poll that Blandon does, there weren't large differences. There was some geographic variation in terms of where people got involved and where they didn't, but we're talking small percentage points here, where for me it wasn't a statistically significant difference. But again, when we're talking about a general number like 53% of rural Minnesotans are engaged in a leadership position, that's whether it's 48 or 56, for me, that's about half of the people, which for me is a pretty astounding number.
That is really an astounding number to me. Are you finding more and more young people stepping into these leadership roles now as these nonprofit groups are developing?
Yeah, and they do it differently too. You know, the way the IRS wants our nonprofit world structured is everybody's got a board, and that board makes the decisions, and that board authenticates actions for the organization in their federal reporting. But the newcomers, they aren't always engaged in such formal activities. So to just use a measure of how many president, vice president, secretary, treasurers, you may be missing some of that, but at the same time, you do need to have that leadership structure. So it's kind of this balance between the formal and the informal that we need to reach here.
Wow, that's really, really fascinating information. Let's just run by your website one more time.
Sure.
If people want to contact you, how they should do that?
Yep, extension.umn.edu, and if you want to email me, my email is benw@umn.edu.
And if you were to do work with someone, how far out in advance would they have to plan to get your expertise?
Not too far
Not
out,
too far.
a month or so. Yep.
Okay.
And we've got lots of educators across the state that know this content too.
Okay. And what's your next project?
Next project, impact of the baby boomer transitions on our rural communities. I believe this is going to open up a lot of housing opportunities for the newcomers in our rural communities.
Very interesting. Well, my guest has been Ben Winchester, Research Fellow with University of Minnesota Extension. Fascinating stuff. Thank you for coming on the show. It's just never dull to have you here. You bet. You've been watching Lakeland Currents, where we're talking about what you're talking about. I'm Ray Gildow. So long until next time.